Hello and welcome to BookBeat. My name is Sue Ellen Zagrabelny, and I'll be your host for BookBeat, the place for all things literary. Our guest today is Marion Dane Bauer. She is the author of a book called Stuff of Stars, and it is a fascinating book written for children, and I'd like her to start by reading it to us.
Thank you, Sue Ellen. I'd be very glad to. The Stuff of Stars. In the dark, in the dark, in the deep, deep dark, a speck floated, invisible as thought, weighty as God. There was yet no time, there was yet no space, no up, no down, no edge, no center. No earth with soaring hawks, scuttling beetles, trees reaching for the sky. There was no sky, no you, no me, only the speck, waiting, waiting. Then one day, in the dark, in the dark, in the deep, deep dark, another speck floated, invisible as dreams, special as love. Waiting, waiting, dividing, changing, growing, until at last you burst into the world, the stuff of stars.
Brava, thank you so much. What inspired you to write that book?
Many years ago, I attended a program at my UU church by a man named Michael Dowd, and the title was something like Death in Deep Time. And he talked about the origins of the universe, and he talked about the way life comes out of death, that the stars had to explode and die before worlds were created. And I was fascinated by it and thought as I listened, this is going to be a book for children someday, very young children, for all people someday. But I didn't know what to do with it. So I just carried it home with me, the ideas, and I carried them around for years. And finally, one day, it rose to the surface again, and I began studying. I began trying to understand what happened in the origins of our universe, because I'm not a scientist, and I didn't have that kind of precise information. And I studied and studied until I had a deep enough knowledge that I could take it and put it in very few words. And then I sat down and began to write. And that was the process that got me here.
My goodness, that is fascinating. How many words is the book, The Stuff of Stars?
I think it's 435.
And is that pretty typical?
It's pretty typical. I consider 450 maximum for a picture book.
Okay. Is that just because that's the attention span, or?
It's because picture books are very technical. They are almost always 32 pages. Actually, they made this one a little longer because the artist wanted more opportunity to illustrate than the 32 pages allowed. And you want very few words on each page because you want lots of room for illustration for the artist to bring their own creativity to whatever the ideas are on the page. And it all has to begin and end within that span of what is 13 spreads, which is a 2-page the presentation of the work.
Oh my, that is fascinating. I'd never thought about how you decide that there was a real reason for books being the length that they were.
The reason has to do with technicalities of printing, that things are printed large, and then the pages are cut and they are printed in quires of 8. So 4 quires of 8 makes 32 pages, and that became the standard length for picture books.
Okay, a quire. That's Q-U-I-R-E?
You're asking me, I believe it's C-H-O-O-I-R, but I don't know. I really don't know what the spelling is of choir.
Well, that's something that I'll have to look up.
I'll have to look it up too.
And put it on our screen when we edit the show.
All right.
Okay. Is there someone special that this book was written for?
I wrote it deeply for myself, which is what I do with all of my books. I'm writing for the child within myself when I'm writing. But finally, the dedication, because this book feels like truly the culmination of a career. It's my 104th book. I've been publishing for over 40 years. And this book is dedicated to my daughter and in memory of my son. And that felt absolutely appropriate, those most important dedications for this, which feels like my most important book.
Oh, wonderful. It is a thrilling book to sit down and look at, and a thrilling book to read, and I would love to read it to one of my great-grands. It would be really fun. What age group is the book geared to?
It's interesting when you ask that. I looked at the cover and discovered that the publisher hadn't set an age group. It's usually the publisher who makes that decision. And I assume the reason they didn't set an age group is because I think this story works for a very, very wide range. Probably traditionally we'd say 4 to 8. Mm-hmm. But I think this is the kind of book you could give to a college graduate on graduation day. It's the kind of book someone could give to their loved one on Valentine's Day. It's a book that is speaking so deeply that it reaches beyond age. And it also, of course, can be read to a very young child.
Mm-hmm. Are you an author of exclusively books for children?
Yes, I have written and published only for children and young adults. I published the whole range from board books for babies through picture books, through nonfiction easy readers and fiction easy readers for just people beginning to read, middle grade novels and young adult novels.
Okay. What's the kind of, I know what a board book is, I know what a picture book is. What's an easy reader?
An easy reader are for first through third grade readers who are just beginning to read and therefore need short sentences and pretty comprehensible words. In a novel for young children, the chapters are short so they can get through a chapter easily. For easy readers, for young readers, you write generally in short sentences because those are bite-sized pieces that someone learning to read can take hold of and get from the beginning to end of and make sense of. And I wrote a number of books on that level for young readers. And I got tired of the short sentences. I can do it, I can make it flow, I can make a rhythm, but I wanted to go back to my more natural style. And so I decided to write a book in verse, a novel in verse for young children. So I could use my longer sentences and I could still give them their bite-sized pieces to take hold of. And I've heard from teachers that it works.
Oh, how wonderful. What's the other book that you have?
The other book I have is my more recent picture book. It's called Winter Dance. And it's the story of a fox who, when the first snowflake falls, starts asking all the animals in the forest what he should do for winter because he doesn't know. And they all give him the advice of what they do. The turtle tells him to bury himself in the mud. The caterpillar tells him to spin himself a chrysalis. And finally, by the end of the story, he finds out what he, as a fox, should do in the winter.
Oh, how lovely. How lovely. Can you tell me what led to you writing for children?
When I was in college, many, many years ago, I mostly studied literature, but I did take a couple creative writing courses. And one day in the process of I sat down, I was supposed to be writing a short story for adults, of course, because those were the only readers who mattered. And I found myself writing a paragraph out of my own 3-year-old background of being barefoot, standing on a sidewalk in my backyard, and stepping from the heat of the sunny sidewalk into the tickle of the grass. And that's all it was, just a paragraph describing that very brief, not very important moment. And in writing that paragraph, I realized that I had touched something that mattered to me, which was my child self. And I set it aside and I went back to writing for grown-ups the way I was supposed to be doing for my class. And for years afterwards, that's what I did. But I always knew one day I was going to sit down and really write what someone might want to publish. And I always knew that when I did that, it would be for children, that the child in me was my deepest audience.
Oh, how fascinating. I purposely have asked questions about writing books for children, not children's books. Do you see a difference in those two pieces of language?
What I see is people who think of children's books often think of teaching something, often think that because I'm a grown-up, I have these important things I need to convey and children need to get it along the way. And that isn't where you start with a children's book. As I said, where you start with a children's book is the child in yourself, your own deep knowledge of that child, your own deep memories of that child. And that's the extra piece you bring to the writing that is the door into the writing that makes it writing for children.
Marion, what keeps you writing for children?
That's a good question, Sue Ellen, because I turned 80 in November, and I do find myself asking at times, where is my authenticity as a children's writer out of this time in my life? My own children are not only grown, but beyond grown. My grandchildren are in college or out of college, except for one tail-end 12-year-old. And I find myself in my own reading often not turning to children's books, but turning to books about old people for some strange reason. And yet that child in me still lives. And I find still I can go back to that place and find a story there and find something that I want to bring alive there.
That's wonderful, because to have a calling, and what I hear you telling me is that you had a calling to write these books.
Yes.
And just what you express gives me a warm feeling, because it's obvious you really cared for your audience.
Yes.
Where do you write?
I have a study in my home. Every home I've had a room designated for a study for a long, long time. But when I started my career, I started in the corner of the bedroom because I didn't have a study there, nor did I consider what I was doing worthy of having a place for it by myself. I started at a rickety typewriter table at the 1956 Smith Corona typewriter that had been my high school graduation gift. And that's what my first novels were written on. But since then, when I move, the first thing I look for in a house is, where will my study be? It's my safe place to go to. It's my sacred place to go to. The advice for people who are developing a spiritual life is to have a place to go to for prayer, that's the only thing they do. And I find it feels the same way to have a study where my work happens. I go into there and immediately that's the frame of mind I'm in. That's what I'm preparing for. That's what I move into when I'm in that sacred space in my home.
That is wonderful. I am preparing to move in the not too distant future, and I found a place that will give me a place that I can have a study, and I'm very excited about it.
Wonderful.
Do you write every day?
I write nearly every day. I wrote every day when I was younger. If my children ever complained about anything, it was that I was spending too much time with my nose in a typewriter or eventually a computer. These days, as I said, having turned 80, I'm beginning to say, maybe there's some other things to do with my time, and maybe I should look at them. But I write most days still. And when there is open time early in the day, I don't write in the evening. There aren't enough brain cells left early in the evening to write well, and so I don't. But in the full daytime, if I have a space of time, I'm at my computer and I'm dipping into whatever is waiting for me there.
Do you have an agent?
I do have an agent now. I had an agent when I started my career, and after a few years I decided she wasn't doing enough for me, and I stepped aside, and I managed my career myself for most of the career. I have, however, gone with an agent in recent years, and I did it for two reasons. One was because contracts began to get more bewildering with electronic book rights and some other new issues coming up. And when I read a contract, my brain goes soft. I might as well get on a sliding board. I start at the beginning and I'm out the other end and I don't know a word of what I've read. So I decided I needed someone looking over my shoulder that way. The other reason I chose to have an agent, again, is because I found I'd made some missteps with a couple of books. I had worked with a number of different editors. I would have an editor in front of me that I liked working with, and I would take a book to her and then discover that it wasn't really appropriate for that list. It would have been better someplace else. And I realized if I had someone looking over my career, that that person would know for me where an appropriate place was to go.
That can help, having that other set of eyes and other set of ears.
It can indeed.
Tell me about your publisher.
The publisher for this book is Candlewick. I have published all across the spectrum. I've published with all the major publishers and any number of smaller ones. But for many years I've watched Candlewick. They do wonderful work, wonderful writers, beautiful books, and I have so much respect for them. I knew the editor-in-chief. I used to teach at Vermont College of Fine Arts at their Master of Fine Arts program, and I knew the editor-in-chief through that program when she visited. And I wanted to be in Candlewick, but I always seemed to be kind of attached to other places. When I did this book, I said to my agent, I want this to go to Candlewick. And so he took it exclusively there to show them, and they took it, and now I'm in at Candlewick for the first time.
Brava, that is wonderful. That is wonderful. Is there any advice that you would have to aspiring writers of children's books?
Well, my first advice is if you want to write for children, you approach it because you love children's books, because you know children's books, and because you love doing exactly what you see other people doing. I have taught for many, many years, and especially when I was teaching amateurs, not in an MFA program does this happen, but people would come in saying, I want to write a children's book because there's nothing good out there. And when they say that, I know that they don't know what's out there. They haven't really pursued what exists in children's books. But so you have to start by knowing the field and loving the field deeply. You have to start, as I've said before, with that child in yourself that you want to speak to, rather than with some idea that I'm going to teach kids something. You start with in a feeling place, because it's the feeling that carries the story, not the teaching moment. You'll teach. Anybody who writes teaches, because you're presenting your deepest thoughts and feelings on the page, and it's going to communicate to someone. But the teaching is secondary, thirtiary, fourthiary. It exists underneath the rest of what's happening. And so you start just with the love of the writing and the love of the child within the writing. And that's where good children's literature happens.
Fascinating. Is there anything else you'd like to add as we end our program today?
I can't think of anything, Sue Ellen. I think we've covered the whole range.
Thank you for joining us today, Marion.
Thank you, Sue Ellen. It was a great pleasure to be here.
Please come back sometime.
Thank you.
And audience, thank you for joining us at BookBeat, the place for all things literary. and we look forward to seeing you next time.